In the autumn of 1833, among the mist-shrouded hills of Western Virginia, a revelation emerged that would forever alter our understanding of scientific courage and human compassion. A secret laboratory, hidden beneath the floorboards of the Thornton family estate, contained experimental medical equipment and 23 volunteer patients with conditions deemed incurable by conventional medicine. The individuals, ranging from the elderly to young children, had each been given a chance at survival through methods that would shake the very foundations of American medical practice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The local sheriff's report, sealed for nearly a century in the Brunswick County Archives, described scenes so revolutionary that 3 medical observers who witnessed the procedures immediately resigned from their prestigious university positions to join what would later be called the Thornton Miracle. What makes this case truly remarkable isn't just the breakthrough treatments discovered, but the chilling realization that Dr. Eleanor Thornton had been operating her innovative medical practice for over 15 years without recognition from the medical establishment. The patients called her the Angel of Brunswick, but the truth behind that title would prove far more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. The question that fascinated investigators then and continues to inspire medical historians today is how such a revolutionary operation could have thrived for so long without recognition from the medical establishment of the time. The Virginia of 1833 was a land caught between 2 worlds. Traditional healing practices still dominated the rural landscape while whispers of medical innovation drifted down from the north. In this environment, the small community of Millfield, a collection of perhaps 60 families spread across the gentle slopes of Brunswick County, represented the typical American rural settlement of the era. Most residents farmed tobacco or wheat, traded at Pemberton's general store, and gathered for social events at the one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a community meeting hall. The Thornton estate sat on the outskirts of this community, an impressive 2-story brick manor surrounded by nearly 150 acres of fertile agricultural land. To any traveler passing along the gravel road that connected Millfield to Richmond, Thornton home appeared to be simply the residence of a prosperous family. The house itself, built in the Federal style popular during the 1810s, featured elegant columns and a wraparound porch, typical of Virginia architecture of wealthy families. A carriage house stood 70 yards behind the main residence with a small cottage and storage buildings completing the estate's layout. What made the Thornton property unique wasn't visible from the road. Dr. James Thornton, who had purchased the land in 1815 with money earned from his successful medical practice in Philadelphia, had spent considerable resources constructing a specialized basement beneath the main house. While most Virginia homes of the period featured simple cellars, the Thornton basement extended far beyond the footprint of the house above. Local craftsmen remembered being hired for various construction projects throughout the 1810s and 1820s. Though none had seen the completed work, Dr. Thornton paid generously and promptly, asking only that the workers focus on their assigned sections rather than concern themselves with the overall design. Eleanor Thornton, James's wife, had arrived in Millfield in 1817 as a bride of 25. Neighbors remembered her as a striking woman with auburn hair and unusually penetrating eyes. She dressed simply but elegantly, attended the Presbyterian church services regularly, and maintained a reputation for extraordinary charitable works. When approached about contributing to community causes, Eleanor would inevitably explain that she and James were already providing medical care to several desperately ill patients from her family connections back in Boston. The arrangement, she explained, was necessary, as these individuals had been rejected by traditional hospitals due to the supposedly incurable nature of their conditions. This explanation satisfied the community's curiosity about the occasional glimpses of strangers around the Thornton property. Mrs. Pemberton at the general store would sometimes notice unfamiliar faces peering from the Thornton carriage when Eleanor came to town for supplies. These visitors never engaged with the townspeople, but Eleanor would explain that they were patients, weakened by their conditions, and needed rest rather than social interaction. The community, familiar with the tragedy of severe illness in an era of limited medical knowledge, accepted these explanations without question. William Pemberton, who operated the general store, later recalled that Eleanor Thornton was one of his most particular customers. Every week, she would arrive with a detailed list and sufficient funds to purchase substantial quantities of specialized items, unusual herbs, imported spices, alcohol for tinctures, clean linen, and other supplies, not typically found in rural Virginia. The quantities seemed excessive for a single household, but when William inquired, Eleanor would remind him about their private patients. She also requested unusual scientific equipment that needed to be special ordered from Richmond or even Philadelphia, explaining that James required these tools for his ongoing medical research. The Thornton estate operated on a schedule that intrigued some neighbors. While most families retired early in the evening, activity at the Thornton property often continued throughout the night. Lights could be seen in the manor windows until dawn, and the sound of carriage wheels sometimes echoed across the fields during the darkest hours. When asked about these activities, James would explain that serious illness doesn't adhere to convenient schedules, and critical treatments often required round-the-clock attention. Dr. Samuel Whitaker, the local physician who served the Millfield area, remembered being invited to the Thornton estate on several occasions during the 1820s and early 1830s. Each time, he was shown selected patients and asked for his professional opinion. However, Dr. Whitaker was never permitted to see the entire operation or to examine all the patients. Instead, James would present specific cases and engage in theoretical discussions about treatment approaches. When the doctor expressed interest in seeing more, James would explain that many patients had requested privacy due to the sensitive nature of their conditions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mystique was so complete that even the local minister, Reverend Jonathan Edwards, believed completely in the Thornton family's medical mission. During his occasional visits to the estate, Reverend Edwards would praise Eleanor and James for their Christian compassion in caring for those whom conventional medicine had abandoned. He offered to bring church members to assist, but Eleanor would always explain that strict quarantine procedures were necessary to protect both patients and the community from potential contagion. What none of the community members realized was that Eleanor Thornton had been perfecting revolutionary medical treatments for over 15 years. The patients were not simply receiving palliative care while awaiting inevitable death. They were subjects in an unprecedented medical revolution, participants in treatments so advanced that they would not become standard practice for another century. The individuals receiving care had come willingly, many traveling great distances after hearing whispers of the miraculous recoveries occurring at the secluded Virginia estate. The discovery that would finally bring the Thornton family's extraordinary work to public attention began with a series of seemingly unrelated incidents in the early months of 1833. January had been unusually mild, with temperatures remaining above freezing even during the coldest nights. The unseasonable warmth that embraced Virginia that winter would prove to be both an advantage and a challenge for the 23 patients receiving experimental treatments beneath the Thornton Manor House. On January 18, 1833, a medical researcher named Dr. Frederick Holloway was traveling from Baltimore to Charleston when a violent storm forced him to seek shelter. The Thornton estate, being the most substantial building visible from the road, seemed like the natural choice for emergency accommodation. James Thornton, recognizing a fellow physician, could hardly refuse hospitality to a stranded colleague during such dangerous weather. Holloway later described the evening as unexpectedly illuminating. Eleanor Thornton served an elaborate meal featuring dishes designed for specific nutritional purposes, and conversation flowed easily between the three medical minds. When Holloway mentioned his research into pulmonary diseases, James exchanged a meaningful glance with Eleanor before inviting their guest to observe something remarkable. What Holloway witnessed that night in the Thornton basement laboratory would alter the course of his career forever. Under the soft glow of oil lamps, Holloway was introduced to a patient with advanced tuberculosis who was breathing normally, his color healthy, his energy restored. The treatment, James explained, involved a specialized inhalation therapy combined with dietary modifications that Eleanor had developed through years of careful observation. When Holloway asked how such a breakthrough had been achieved, James claimed it was the result of combining ancient herbal knowledge with modern, scientific principles, an approach rejected by most conventional medical institutions. The second incident occurred 2 weeks later on February 5th. Catherine Morgan, a mother of 3 traveling with her family to seek treatment for her youngest child's epilepsy, had heard rumors of the Thornton success with neurological conditions. Desperate after years of watching her 6-year-old daughter suffer through violent seizures, Catherine arrived at the Thornton estate unannounced, begging for assistance. Eleanor welcomed the exhausted family, offering food and shelter while she assessed the child's condition. Within days, young Sarah Morgan experienced her first seizure-free week since infancy. When Catherine asked how such improvement was possible when Boston's finest doctors had declared the condition untreatable, Eleanor explained her theory that many seizures were triggered by specific dietary elements, particularly certain grains. The specialized diet she prescribed, combined with a carefully measured herbal tincture administered 3 times daily, had shown remarkable results across dozens of similar cases. Eleanor had documented each case meticulously, creating a body of evidence that would later astonish the medical community. The final incident that would lead to public revelation occurred on March 12, 1833. A respected Richmond physician named Dr. Jonathan Pierce was searching for new approaches to treat his own daughter's advancing blindness when he heard whispers of miraculous recoveries occurring at a private estate in Brunswick County. Initially skeptical, Pierce decided that desperation justified investigation. He arrived at the Thornton estate with formal introduction letters from mutual acquaintances in Philadelphia. James and Eleanor welcomed him professionally but cautiously. For nearly a week, Pierce observed their methods, examined their records, and interviewed willing patients. What he witnessed challenged everything he had learned during his medical training. Patients with conditions considered permanently debilitating were showing remarkable improvement. Careful documentation demonstrated consistent results across years of treatment. Most importantly, the Thorntons' ethical approach, obtaining written consent, maintaining detailed records, adjusting treatments based on outcomes, represented a standard of medical practice far beyond the typical approach of the era. When Pierce asked why they hadn't published their findings, James explained the dilemma that had kept their work hidden. Early in their career, they had attempted to share their discoveries with medical colleagues, only to face ridicule, accusations of quackery, and threats of legal action. The medical establishment of the early 19th century, dominated by bleeding, purging, and other treatments based more on tradition than evidence, viewed their approach as dangerous heresy. Rather than abandon their effective methods, the Thorntons had chosen to work in relative secrecy, helping those who found their way to the estate while meticulously documenting everything for eventual vindication. Pierce's daughter began treatment for her condition, a progressive retinal deterioration, on March 20th. By April, her vision had stabilized for the first time in years. Convinced that the Thorntons' work represented the future of medicine, Pierce made a momentous decision. Despite the potential risk to his own reputation, he would bring their discoveries to public attention. On the morning of April 8, 1833, Dr. Pierce invited Sheriff Thomas Blackwood of Brunswick County to accompany him to the Thornton estate, along with two respected colleagues from Richmond's Medical Society. He had arranged this official visit with the Thorntons' consent, believing that proper witnesses were essential for what would inevitably become a controversial revelation. The sheriff, initially puzzled by the request, agreed primarily out of respect for Pierce's standing in the community. The formal inspection began with a tour of the main laboratory areas. James Thornton welcomed the visitors with calm professionalism, explaining that he and Eleanor had been expecting this day for many years. The time had come, he believed, for their work to face public scrutiny. Sheriff Blackwood, who had anticipated finding signs of impropriety, instead discovered an operation of remarkable organization and apparent compassion. The basement that James Thornton had spent over a decade constructing was a marvel of medical innovation. The main chamber, stretching far beyond the footprint of the house above, contained specialized treatment areas for different conditions. Stone walls, carefully sealed and ventilated, created spaces with controlled temperature and humidity, conditions that research had shown affected recovery rates for certain ailments. The design, revolutionary for its time, included skylights, cleverly disguised as garden features above ground, providing natural illumination to the underground facilities. In the primary treatment room, the visitors observed patients receiving care for conditions ranging from respiratory diseases to neurological disorders. Each individual had private quarters, personalized treatment protocols, and a level of medical attention unheard of in conventional hospitals of the era. What struck Sheriff Blackwood most forcefully was the atmosphere. Unlike the grim, hopeless environment he had anticipated, the Thornton facility felt optimistic, even peaceful. Patients spoke freely, describing their conditions, the treatments they were receiving, and the improvements they had experienced. Dr. Alan Richardson, one of the Richmond physicians accompanying the inspection, initially maintained professional skepticism. Having trained at Edinburgh's prestigious medical school, he viewed American medical practices with particular suspicion. However, as Eleanor Thornton guided him through their case documentation, his expression gradually shifted from doubt to astonishment. The Thorntons had maintained records of unprecedented detail, daily observations, treatment adjustments, outcome measurements for every patient over a 15-year period. The methodical approach represented a standard of medical documentation that exceeded anything Richardson had encountered in Europe. In the specialized research chamber, James demonstrated their process for developing new treatments. Unlike the trial and error approach common in conventional medicine, the Thorntons began with careful observation of natural recoveries, identified patterns, developed theoretical models, and then systematically tested modifications under controlled conditions. They had essentially created the scientific method for medical treatment decades before it would become standard practice. The most compelling evidence came from the patients themselves. Sarah Morgan, the child with epilepsy who had arrived just weeks earlier, demonstrated dramatic improvement. Catherine Morgan tearfully explained that after years of watching her daughter suffer multiple seizures daily, they had experienced only 2 minor episodes in nearly a month of treatment. An elderly man with crippling arthritis demonstrated remarkable mobility, crediting a combination of dietary changes, specialized physical movements, and herbal preparations that Eleanor had developed. The investigation expanded as word spread throughout the medical community. Over the following weeks, physicians from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia made the journey to Brunswick County to witness the Thornton methods firsthand. The initial skepticism gradually gave way to reluctant admiration, particularly as the visitors examined the meticulous records and interviewed recovering patients. The evidence was becoming difficult to dismiss, even for the most traditional medical practitioners. James and Eleanor's documentation revealed the scope of their operation. Since establishing their practice in 1817, they had treated over 200 patients with conditions ranging from infectious diseases to chronic degenerative disorders. Their success rates, carefully tracked and verified, far exceeded those of conventional treatments. Most remarkably, they had achieved these results while causing significantly less suffering than the standard medical approaches of bleeding, blistering, and purging that dominated 19th century medicine. The legal implications were complicated by the fact that while the Thorntons both had formal medical training, James, from the University of Pennsylvania, and Eleanor through apprenticeship with her physician father in Boston, Eleanor lacked official credentials as women were barred from most medical schools. Their practice, operating outside the conventional medical establishment, existed in a gray area that authorities struggled to evaluate. As weeks passed, more recovered patients came forward with their stories. The accounts were remarkably consistent, describing compassionate care, innovative treatments, and results that had seemed impossible under conventional medical wisdom. Former patients spoke of arriving at the Thornton estate as a last resort, often after being told their conditions were incurable, only to experience significant improvement or complete recovery. The survivors also revealed the extent of the Thorntons' ethical approach. Every patient or their family had been fully informed about the experimental nature of the treatments. Alternative options, including conventional care, were always discussed. Most importantly, no one was ever charged for treatment. The entire operation had been funded through James's inheritance and careful investment. This philanthropic model stood in stark contrast to the fee-based structure of traditional medicine, where physicians often had financial incentives to provide treatments, regardless of effectiveness. The investigation uncovered evidence of the Thorntons' methodical approach to advancing medical knowledge. They had developed relationships with suppliers of rare botanical specimens from around the world, corresponded with unconventional healers from various cultures, and maintained a vast library of medical texts in multiple languages. They had essentially created a private research institution decades before such facilities became common in America. Perhaps most remarkably, the records showed that the Thornton approach had been steadily refined through careful observation and adjustment. Treatments that proved ineffective were documented and abandoned. Successful approaches were systematically improved. The entire operation represented an evidence-based approach to medicine that wouldn't become mainstream for another century. The breakthrough that would lead to the complete acceptance of the Thornton methods came from an unexpected source. Among the patients at the facility was a 12-year-old boy named Thomas, the son of a prominent Boston merchant. Thomas had suffered from a severe form of diabetes, a condition generally considered fatal in the 1830s. Under Eleanor's care, which included a specialized diet and herbal preparations that helped regulate blood sugar levels, Thomas had not only survived but thrived for nearly 2 years. Thomas's father, Harold Winthrop, was a major financial supporter of Harvard Medical School. When his son's condition improved dramatically under the Thorntons' care, Winthrop used his considerable influence to arrange a formal evaluation by a team of Harvard physicians. The Harvard delegation, initially prepared to debunk what they considered provincial quackery, instead found themselves confronted with irrefutable evidence of medical advancement. The Harvard team's report, published in August 1833, sent shockwaves through the American medical establishment. While carefully worded to avoid directly challenging medical orthodoxy, the document acknowledged that the Thornton protocols demonstrated remarkable efficacy worthy of serious scientific consideration. This cautious endorsement from one of America's most prestigious medical institutions opened the door for broader acceptance. The most significant revelation came when the Harvard physicians analyzed Eleanor's specialized diabetes treatment. The dietary regimen she had developed through careful observation and adjustment was remarkably similar to what would, nearly a century later, be recognized as the standard approach to managing the condition. Without modern measuring tools or biochemical understanding, Eleanor had essentially discovered the relationship between carbohydrate intake and blood sugar regulation through methodical clinical observation. As Sheriff Blackwood delved deeper into the Thornton case, fascinating patterns emerged that suggested their operation was far more sophisticated than initially believed. The correspondence found in their extensive files revealed that Eleanor and James had been in regular contact with unconventional medical practitioners across Europe, particularly in Germany and Austria, where early scientific approaches to medicine were beginning to challenge traditional methods. The letters, written in several languages and meticulously organized by topic, discussed everything from botanical pharmacology to early concepts of germ theory, decades before it gained widespread acceptance. One letter dated just 2 months before. The investigation came from a Dr. Muller in Vienna, describing promising results from hand-washing protocols in reducing maternal mortality, practices similar to those that Eleanor had implemented in her treatment of vulnerable patients years earlier. The financial records painted a picture of extraordinary dedication to their mission. The Thornton family had invested nearly their entire fortune in creating and maintaining their medical facility. Ledgers showed expenditures for specialized equipment imported from Europe, rare medicinal plants from Asia and South America, and scientific texts that formed one of the most comprehensive medical libraries in America. Unlike conventional physicians who derive their income directly from patient fees, the Thorntons had created a philanthropic model focused entirely on advancing treatment methods. Dr. Samuel Whitaker, the local physician who had occasionally consulted with the Thorntons, became a key witness as the investigation expanded. Under further questioning, he revealed that James had often shared theoretical concepts far ahead of their time, including early ideas about antiseptic practice, nutritional influences on recovery, and the body's natural healing mechanisms. Whitaker had initially dismissed many of these concepts as speculative, but the evidence of their effectiveness was becoming impossible to ignore. The doctor's testimony led to another remarkable realization. The Thorntons had been systematically studying how to create optimal healing environments, controlling air quality, light exposure, and psychological comfort decades before such factors were recognized as important to recovery. The specialized basement design, initially viewed with suspicion by investigators, was revealed to be an ingenious solution for maintaining consistent temperature and humidity levels beneficial for certain conditions. Local businessman William Pemberton provided additional insights into the Thorntons' operation. A review of his store's records showed that Eleanor's purchases had followed distinct patterns aligned with their evolving treatment protocols. What had seemed like odd requests for exotic spices, specific minerals, and unusual quantities of certain foods were actually evidence of carefully calibrated, therapeutic diets tailored to different conditions. The investigation also revealed the role of James Thornton in the operation. While Eleanor appeared to be the innovative force behind many of the treatments, James had provided the scientific rigor that transformed promising observations into reliable protocols. His meticulous documentation, controlled testing methods, and statistical analysis of outcomes had created a body of evidence that even the most skeptical physicians found difficult to dismiss. Several of the patients, when interviewed separately, described James as the methodical scientist who refined Eleanor's intuitive breakthroughs. He had designed specialized equipment for measuring patient progress, created standardized preparations to ensure consistent treatment quality, and developed a system for identifying which patients would likely benefit from specific approaches. His contribution represented an early version of the clinical trial methodology that would eventually become the gold standard for medical advancement. The most compelling aspect of the investigation emerged as authorities examined the long-term outcomes of the Thornton treatments. Former patients, some treated nearly 15 years earlier, were located and evaluated by independent physicians. The results were extraordinary. Individuals with conditions traditionally considered permanent disabilities had maintained improvements years after completing their treatment. This sustainability of results contradicted the common 19th century experience of temporary relief followed by inevitable decline. The scope of the investigation expanded as medical authorities in other states began examining the Thornton methods for potential adoption. Delegations from Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York traveled to Brunswick County to observe the protocols firsthand. These visits, initially motivated by skepticism, frequently resulted in physicians returning to their home institutions as advocates for the revolutionary approaches they had witnessed. Federal representatives were called in to evaluate the broader implications for American medical practice. This was unprecedented for the time period, as medical regulation was minimal and standardization nearly non-existent. The Thornton case represented one of the first major medical evaluations to cross state lines and involve governmental assessment. The implications were complicated by the fact that many of the treatments contradicted established medical doctrine, while producing superior results. As months passed, more patients began to share their stories publicly. The accounts were remarkably consistent, describing a transformative approach that addressed not just physical symptoms, but overall well-being. The patients described how the Thornton protocols included customized nutrition, specific physical activities, mental exercises, and carefully formulated botanical preparations, an integrated approach that would eventually be recognized as the foundation of modern holistic medicine. The survivors also revealed the extent of Eleanor's psychological insights. She had recognized decades before mainstream medicine that mental state significantly impacted physical recovery. Patients described how she created environments of hope rather than resignation, how she involved them as active participants in their treatment rather than passive recipients, and how she tailored approaches to individual temperaments and needs. These psychological dimensions of care, revolutionary for the 1830s, anticipated developments in medical practice that wouldn't become standard for another century. The investigation uncovered evidence of the Thorntons' methods for selecting patients. Unlike conventional physicians who primarily served those who could afford their fees, the Thorntons had developed relationships with community leaders across the region who would identify individuals with significant medical needs but limited resources. They had also cultivated contacts among progressive physicians who would refer particularly challenging cases when conventional treatments had failed. Their selection criteria focused on potential for improvement rather than ability to pay, a radical departure from medical practice of the era. Perhaps most impressively, the records showed that the Thornton operation had been expanding its scope in recent years. The number of conditions being successfully treated had increased, and there were plans in the correspondence for training other practitioners in their methods. The investigation had apparently revealed a medical revolution that was on the verge of transforming American healthcare. The breakthrough that would lead to the complete integration of the Thornton methods into mainstream medicine came from an unexpected source. Among the patients was a woman named Rebecca Anderson, approximately 30 years old, who had been suffering from a severe autoimmune condition that modern medicine would identify as lupus. Unlike the other patients who had been benefiting from treatment for months or years, Rebecca had arrived just weeks before the investigation began. Rebecca had been the daughter of a prominent Charleston physician who had dismissed the Thornton methods as quackery without investigation. When conventional treatments failed to help his own daughter, desperate circumstances drove him to send Rebecca to the Virginia estate as a last resort. The transformation in her condition over just 3 weeks provided compelling before and after evidence that even the most traditional physicians found difficult to dismiss. More importantly, Rebecca's medical background as a physician's daughter had allowed her to understand and document her own treatment with unusual precision. Her journal, written with both patient perspective and medical insight, became a powerful testament to the effectiveness of the Thornton approach. Her descriptions of how specific interventions affected her symptoms, energy levels, and overall function provided a compelling case study that would be published in medical journals across the country. Rebecca's testimony revealed that the Thornton operation was just one manifestation of a broader vision. She had heard Eleanor discussing plans for a teaching institution where their methods could be shared with other practitioners, a hospital where patients of all backgrounds could receive care regardless of financial means, and a research facility where promising treatments could be systematically evaluated. She remembered Eleanor describing a future where medicine would be based on evidence rather than tradition, where female practitioners would be valued for their insights, and where the focus would be on healing rather than merely treating symptoms. The most significant revelation came when Rebecca described the underlying philosophy that guided the Thornton approach. Unlike conventional medicine, which viewed the body as a collection of separate systems, Eleanor saw interconnections. How digestion affected brain function, how emotional states influenced physical healing, how environmental factors impacted recovery. This holistic vision anticipated scientific understandings that would not be confirmed for generations. Rebecca's journal also revealed the personal cost the Thorntons had paid for their revolutionary work. She had overheard conversations about the professional isolation they experienced, the rejection by former colleagues, and the emotional toll of operating outside established medical structures. Yet despite these challenges, they had remained committed to their evidence-based approach, placing patient outcomes above professional acceptance. The investigation team used Rebecca's information to coordinate visits to other experimental medical facilities across the country. Medical researchers working with federal authorities simultaneously examined similar operations in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York. The investigations were conducted with unprecedented thoroughness to determine whether the Thornton case was unique or part of a broader movement towards scientific medicine. The results of the coordinated investigations were remarkable. While the Thornton operation was by far the most advanced, several other practitioners were beginning to adopt similar evidence-based approaches. These pioneers, often working in isolation and facing professional ostracism, represented the early stages of a transformation in American medicine. The Thornton methods, it appeared, were not an anomaly, but the leading edge of an inevitable evolution. The evidence seized during the investigations painted a picture of systematic innovation that inspired the nation. The Thornton operation had been developing and refining therapeutic approaches for over 15 years, had treated hundreds of patients with unprecedented success rates, and had documented everything with scientific precision. The level of organization and methodology was unprecedented for any medical enterprise of the time period. The botanical preparations developed by Eleanor were analyzed by chemists from Philadelphia and found to contain compounds that would eventually be recognized as having legitimate medicinal properties. Her dietary protocols were studied by nutritional pioneers and found to address deficiencies common in specific conditions. The physical therapy techniques developed by James were evaluated by European specialists and found to accelerate recovery from certain injuries and disabilities. The investigation also revealed the corruption within the conventional medical establishment that had resisted the Thornton innovations. Officials at prestigious medical schools had rejected their findings without examination. Journal editors had refused to publish their results despite compelling evidence. Influential physicians had threatened colleagues who showed interest in the alternative approaches. Even some government representatives had been pressured to discredit the Thornton methods without proper evaluation. As the scope of the medical revolution became clear, the investigation faced increasing support from progressive forces within the medical community. Several prominent physicians who had initially approached the case with skepticism became advocates after reviewing the evidence. Medical students began petitioning their institutions to incorporate the Thornton methods into their training. Even Some traditional practitioners began cautiously adapting elements of the approach that seemed most compatible with their existing practice. The situation became even more promising when one of America's wealthiest industrialists, Harold Montgomery, whose wife had been successfully treated for a chronic condition by the Thorntons, offered substantial financial backing for their work. Montgomery proposed establishing a foundation that would support both the continued operation of the Brunswick facility and the creation of a training institute where the methods could be taught to new generations of practitioners. The pressure reached its peak when Eleanor Thornton was invited to address the American Medical Society's annual conference, an unprecedented honor for any female medical practitioner. The invitation represented a dramatic shift in the establishment's position and acknowledgement that the evidence could no longer be ignored. Eleanor's presentation, scheduled for October 1833, would represent the official introduction of their methods to the mainstream medical community. The anticipation surrounding Eleanor's presentation sent ripples through the medical establishment. If powerful evidence was presented publicly, no physician involved in patient care could justifiably ignore the superior results of the Thornton methods. The presentation had the potential to transform American medicine virtually overnight, challenging centuries of traditional practice with documented evidence of more effective approaches. Just when it seemed that the medical revolution would achieve complete acceptance, an unexpected development threatened everything. James Thornton, whose scientific documentation had provided the foundation for their credibility, fell seriously ill with pneumonia in September 1833. The illness, possibly contracted during long hours working with infectious patients, progressed rapidly despite Eleanor's best efforts to treat him. The medical community held its breath as Eleanor fought to save her husband using the very methods they had developed together. The situation became a public test case for their approach, with daily bulletins on James's condition appearing in newspapers across the eastern seaboard. For nearly 2 weeks, the outcome remained uncertain as James battled the infection that had claimed countless lives in the pre-antibiotic era. James's eventual recovery, while not complete by the time of the October conference, provided the most powerful testament possible to their methods. Eleanor arrived at the American Medical Society meeting, not just with documentation and patient testimonials, but with the living example of her husband, who had survived a condition that killed approximately 30% of those it afflicted. The personal element transformed what might have been an abstract scientific presentation into a deeply human story of innovation born from necessity and compassion. Eleanor Thornton's address to the American Medical Society on October 15, 1833, would be remembered as the moment that modern scientific medicine truly began in America. Speaking with quiet authority to an audience that included both staunch critics and newfound supporters, Eleanor systematically presented their methodology, evidence, and results. Rather than attacking traditional practices directly, she positioned their approach as an evolution rather than a revolution, a natural progression toward more effective care. The address was remarkable not just for its content, but for its approach. Eleanor presented their discoveries as questions rather than assertions, inviting collaborative investigation rather than demanding acceptance. She acknowledged the limitations of their methods, identified areas requiring further research, and proposed a framework for cooperative advancement that would include practitioners from all medical traditions. The humility and scientific integrity of her presentation disarmed many critics who had come prepared for confrontation. Most persuasively, Eleanor introduced several former patients who had traveled to Philadelphia specifically to support her presentation. These individuals, representing a variety of ages, backgrounds, and previously untreatable conditions, provided living testimony to the effectiveness of the Thornton methods. Their personal stories transformed statistical evidence into human impact, making the case for change in terms no compassionate physician could dismiss. The response to Eleanor's presentation was not immediate conversion, but something potentially more valuable: serious engagement. The Society appointed a formal committee to evaluate the Thornton protocols, authorized funding for comparative studies, and established a journal specifically for publishing results of innovative treatments. The wall of institutional resistance had not collapsed entirely, but significant cracks had appeared that would gradually widen in the coming years. The legal proceedings that followed would establish important precedents for medical practice and research. Rather than facing charges for operating outside conventional standards, the Thorntons became the center of a broader examination of how medical innovation should be evaluated and regulated. The Brunswick County investigation evolved into a federally supported assessment of evidence-based medicine that would eventually inform the creation of America's first meaningful medical practice standards. The federal report, released in February 1834, represented a carefully balanced approach to the revolutionary methods. While stopping short of wholesale endorsement, the document acknowledged that many Thornton protocols demonstrated superior outcomes and should be incorporated into conventional practice. The report also recommended legal protections for medical researchers, whose work challenged established doctrine but was conducted with appropriate safeguards and documentation. The public reaction to the revelations was one of cautious optimism mixed with traditional suspicion of medical claims. Newspapers across the country covered the story in unprecedented detail, with many publications dedicating special sections to explaining the Thornton methods in terms accessible to general readers. Medical journals, initially divided on the significance of the discoveries, gradually shifted toward acceptance as the evidence became impossible to dismiss. The surviving patients faced a far different future than they had anticipated when first arriving at the Brunswick County estate. Rather than living with progressive disability or preparing for early death, many found themselves not just surviving but thriving. The psychological impact of this unexpected second chance transformed many into passionate advocates for medical innovation and patient rights, creating a grassroots movement that would continue to influence healthcare for decades. Thomas, the 12-year-old diabetic boy whose case had helped convince the Harvard physicians, became something of a celebrity as news of his remarkable improvements spread. However, the attention proved challenging for a child who simply wanted to return to normal life. His family eventually established a foundation that would fund research into metabolic disorders, creating a legacy that continues to save lives. Nearly 2 centuries later, the legal proceedings revealed the full extent of the scientific contribution that the Thornton methods represented. James, who had recovered sufficiently to participate in later evaluations, worked with medical researchers to standardize their protocols for broader implementation. The rigorous testing methods he had developed became models for early clinical trials, establishing concepts of control groups and outcome measurements that would eventually become fundamental to medical research. Henry Blackwood, the wealthy donor who had supported the Thornton operation during its most challenging years, established America's first dedicated medical research institute in Richmond. The Thornton Institute, founded in 1835, would become a pioneering center for evidence-based medicine, eventually growing into one of the nation's premier medical research facilities. Blackwood's investment represented a new model of philanthropic support for scientific advancement that would transform American medicine. The 2 physicians from Boston, who had initially dismissed the Thornton methods as provincial quackery, became unlikely converts after participating in the federal investigation. Their subsequent advocacy within prestigious medical institutions helped legitimate the innovative approaches and accelerate their adoption. Their willingness to publicly acknowledge their previous error represented a powerful example of scientific integrity that influenced a generation of medical students. The investigation's most lasting impact was on medical education and practice standards. The case led to significant reforms in how physicians were trained, introducing requirements for evidence-based treatments, outcome documentation, and continued learning that would gradually transform American healthcare. Virginia passed the first comprehensive medical practice standards in the nation, establishing requirements for physician training and treatment documentation that would eventually be adopted nationwide. The federal government also responded with new approaches to medical regulation and research support. The Thornton case had demonstrated both the potential benefits of medical innovation and the institutional barriers that often prevented its adoption. New federal offices were established to evaluate treatment outcomes, support promising research, and ensure that effective methods weren't suppressed by entrenched interests. These early regulatory efforts would eventually evolve into the sophisticated systems that govern modern healthcare. Perhaps most importantly, the case changed public expectations about medical treatment and evidence. The romantic notion of the physician as an authority figure whose judgment should never be questioned was replaced by a more scientific understanding of medicine as a continuously evolving field. The phrase, "show me the evidence," entered common usage as patients began demanding demonstration of effectiveness rather than appeals to tradition or authority. Dr. Samuel Whitaker, the local physician who had initially viewed the Thornton methods with professional skepticism, dedicated the remainder of his career to integrating their discoveries into conventional practice. He established one of the nation's first training programs for rural physicians based on evidence-based approaches, helping spread the revolution to communities far from medical centers. His later writings on medical ethics were heavily influenced by the Thornton case, particularly their patient-centered approach and commitment to continued improvement. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, who had led the initial investigation expecting to find exploitation, became an unlikely advocate for medical innovation. His detailed reports on the Thornton case emphasized the importance of evaluating evidence rather than assumptions, a principle he applied to his law enforcement career for decades afterward. Blackwood's willingness to change his position when presented with compelling evidence represented the scientific mindset that the Thorntons had championed. The patient's stories, as they emerged over the years, revealed the full scope of human resilience and the transformative power of effective medical care. Many who had arrived at the Brunswick estate with little hope of improvement went on to lead productive lives, raise families, and contribute to their communities. Their experiences demonstrated that many conditions considered permanent in the 1830s could be significantly improved with appropriate intervention, a message of hope that resonated across the nation. The Thornton correspondence, which had been preserved during the investigation, provided researchers with insights that led to additional medical advances for years afterward. Letters between Eleanor and practitioners across Europe and Asia contained references to promising treatments, theoretical frameworks, and clinical observations that would guide medical research for decades. Some of these leads resulted in significant therapeutic breakthroughs, while others opened entirely new avenues of investigation. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the realization that the Thornton operation had been just one example of how medical innovation often occurs at the margins of established practice. The investigation revealed that similar approaches had been developed in other parts of the country and around the world, that effective treatments had been discovered and forgotten throughout history, and that progress often depends on practitioners willing to challenge conventional wisdom with methodical observation and documentation. The case also highlighted the role of gender in medical innovation. Eleanor Thornton, denied formal medical education because of her sex, had nevertheless developed insights and approaches that male physicians with prestigious credentials had overlooked. Her success challenged fundamental assumptions about who could contribute to medical knowledge and opened discussions about expanding educational opportunities for women with scientific aptitude. While full medical education for women remained decades away, the Thornton case became a powerful argument for inclusivity in scientific training. The legacy of the Thornton case extended far beyond the immediate reforms it inspired. The detailed documentation of their methodology, including the correspondence, treatment protocols, and outcome measurements, became an invaluable resource for understanding the development of scientific medicine in America. Medical historians, researchers, and educators would study the case for generations, using it to understand how evidence-based approaches evolved from individual innovation to institutional standard. In the end, the Thornton family's medical revolution was validated not by academic acceptance or governmental approval, but by the simple metric they had always valued most: patient outcomes. The hundreds of individuals who regained function, extended their lives, or avoided suffering through their treatments represented the true measure of their contribution. When Eleanor was asked years later about her greatest achievement, she reportedly pointed not to the prestigious appointments or academic recognition that eventually came her way, but to her patient records, each entry representing a life improved through methodical observation, courageous innovation, and compassionate care. The basement where 23 volunteers received experimental treatments has been preserved as a medical historical site, but the echoes of their courage continue to inspire us to challenge assumptions, follow evidence rather than tradition, and remember that the greatest medical advances often begin with a simple question: what if there's a better way? If this story has inspired you, you understand why these transformative chapters of American medical history must never be forgotten. Just when we thought we understood the development of modern medicine, pioneering efforts like those at the Thornton estate deepen our appreciation for the courage required to challenge established practices. If this story is inspiring you, share this video with a friend who loves medical history. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what other revolutionary moments lie hidden in America's past. This story shows us that progress often depends on those willing to work outside established systems, follow evidence rather than tradition, and prioritize results over recognition. What do you think of this remarkable chapter in medical history? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still revolutionary approaches waiting to be discovered? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more inspiring stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates medical history. The transformative moments of American innovation have many more lessons to teach, and we'll be here to uncover them all. See you in the next video. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.